We're going to be doing Parsha Emor. We're going to learn a little bit about Parsha Emor this evening. We prepare ourselves for Shavuos, leading up to the days of Shavuos. So, some of the points that we have in Emor, it opens up with the story of the kohanim, about the laws that a Kohen has to have. And they are very strict upon a Kohen of things that they can and cannot do, who they can marry, how they can defile themselves. I believe after that, I don't have a chumash in front of me, but after that we discuss basically the holidays. We go through the entire set of all the holidays, all the way Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkot, everything. Obviously not Hanukkah and Purim; those are rabbinic. But we go through the general holidays, and then we also all the different aspects of what you have to do for each of those holidays, and then discuss the Shabbos as well, and basically ends off with the the story of the Ish Yisraelis, that this man who was blasphemous towards God, and they had to take him, put him in prison, and then they had to then they stoned him to death. That's the happy ending of the parsha. So we're going to look at a few things this evening. First thing is the Torah opens up this week with the concept of Parsha Emor, that it says, the first verse opens up that Emor, to say over to the kohanim, v'amarta lehem, and then you should say to them. The question is, the commentaries ask the obvious question, why does it have to say the word say to them twice? So whenever it says that, it means that because of the fact that, number one, Rashi quotes, that has to be to warn the elders, meaning the adults, as well as the children. The children of kohanim, they also have to be warned to ensure that they don't defile themselves. The kohanim are a specific people that have to keep themselves in a state of purity. The obvious question is, why is it the kohanim have to keep themselves in a state of purity? One, a Kohen cannot marry a divorcee, right? Kohen cannot marry a divorcee. A Kohen Gadol, which means the head Kohen, cannot marry a widow or a divorcee. Okay? A Kohen cannot marry a woman that had relations with a non-Jew. A Kohen, so those are some of the major ones, which means if a Kohen did and they had a child through that union, that child is no longer a Kohen. They lost it, they blew it. If, however, the Kohen gets divorced, then he has saved himself from that, and his child is considered invalid and is a serious problem of who he can marry. But the Kohen is back to his original status. So here's another concept where the acts that someone does can actually have an effect on somebody else. Well, but that's not fair. It's not my fault. Too bad, right? Too bad. I mean, the same case of a mamzer, where if a woman has a child out of wedlock means that they were married once before and they didn't have a proper divorce. So that's called wedlock. That's not what we call in American terms of wedlock. But wedlock means a person's married, they didn't get a get, they didn't get a proper bill of divorce, and then they went and had a child with somebody else, whether through marriage, whether not through marriage. So that child is called a mamzer or a mamzeret, depending if it's a boy or a girl. And that person cannot marry a regular Jew. They can only marry another mamzer, someone who else was born out of wedlock, or they can marry a convert. That's it. Those are the only possibilities, and that goes on forever. So that's a pretty difficult situation. But it's not their fault. You're right, it's not their fault. The Torah says that we're going to live through life knowing that there are going to be things that are somebody else's fault, but that's how the cookie crumbles. You're going to have to realize that there's certain levels of kedusha, of holiness, that must be established, and therefore they cannot be broken. So it's a hard thing to swallow, but unfortunately that's what the law is. So similarly with the Kohen, he has certain rules. If he breaks those rules, that's going to have an effect on his child and his offspring, and therefore he can't actually break those rules. So there are a number of rules that are associated when it comes to purity and impurity. A Kohen has many laws. Just today, the Kohanim have limited number of laws. One of those laws is defilement. They cannot become defiled in front of a corpse, which means they cannot be in a place where a corpse and they are under the same roof. It also means that they can't come in contact with a corpse. So that happens to deal with cemeteries, obviously. Many people know. It also has to deal with being under a tree where there is a corpse buried as well, which is why a Kohen, nobody a Kohen over here, right? No Kohanim over here? You'll tell your Kohanim friends, right? Which is why a Kohen has to be careful when they're driving near a cemetery, by a Jewish cemetery, that the trees that overhang, they can't be under those trees that overhang. So let's say you're on on Rinaldi, and you're driving down from east to west, and you're coming down. So if you go to the left side, you're under the trees that hang over Eden, and they hang over both sides, the cemetery and the driver and the right lane. So Kohen has a problem for actually driving there. Some would say maybe if they're in the car and their windows are closed, it's okay, but others don't like that idea, so it poses a problem. So these are some of the nuances that a Kohen has to deal with. If a Kohen's in a house and they find out that someone's about to die, he's got to run out as quickly as he can. So
if it's their family.
Same thing.
It's like their husband, wife, children.
Yeah, so that's
parents,
different if
same
it's
thing?
the 7 immediate relatives. 7 immediate relatives, and they can actually be part of the funeral for the 7 immediate relatives. Yeah.
Is animal and human? I mean, obviously human, but
Only human beings.
Okay.
Only human beings and only Jews that really apply that tumah, that impurity actually applies to.
Have they labeled animals yet, Jewish and non-Jewish?
No, she means like there's a kind of like if there are a dead rodent, you can't touch certain things, but it doesn't mean that he can still be in the room with those things, right?
Okay.
But the other one has what's called tumas ohel. It has a level of impurity. So, and I was like, I got to give my dog a, come on, Phil, I got to give my dog a bark mitzvah, right? I got it. Okay, got it. Okay.
Yeah, New Zealand,
Sorry.
they may have done that already, by the way.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah, they have them over
They
there,
have
don't we?
animal rights and human rights are the same.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so the key is of understanding for ourselves really what impurity is, the impurity of death. So I want to quote to you one idea that comes from Rav Hirsch, and it's quoted in Rabbi Monk's Sefer. So he says as follows, that when it comes to Tumah, generally we try to avoid ourselves getting impurified, which means we generally avoid ourselves, good job, right? Right? We generally try to avoid ourselves becoming impure by dead body, even though we go to cemeteries on a regular basis, but there's an element of impurity that actually pulls us down spiritually and has an effect. Those that are more spiritually inclined will feel it when they go to a cemetery. They'll feel a heaviness that's around them. But the key is like this. The body deprived of a soul is a source of contamination. That's what the Zohar says. This idea ties into what Rav Hirsch writes. The various cases of contamination derive from the principal source of impurity. The human corpse, referred to by our sages, is what's known as the Avi Avos Hatuma, is the father of all impurities, and that is because death is the ultimate expression of the stripping of the soul and spirit from the matter. Okay, once the soul is gone, then that is the ultimate essence of impurity. Thus, the dead body represents physical nature in its most absolute form, and is the negation of the moral freedom that life offers to us. That freedom is the foundation of our ability to serve God and to uplift ourselves towards the holy ideal. Incidentally, it's important to note, important to note that they had on the news yesterday or today that some man whose wife died, he felt that the greatest comfort he could have is sleeping next to his wife for about 5 days. So she had passed away in bed, whatever it was, and he woke up and she wasn't alive, so he didn't inform anybody for the next 5 or something days, and he wanted to lie next to her during that time, right? A little bit.
Is this in New Zealand?
Maybe, I don't know. It was a news story.
Oh, that's gross.
It's really, but because people don't, people don't realize that life is really what has a soul infused. And that without that, that's not life at all. So to try to say that this is going to give you the greatest comfort, but that means that you're living a life that's totally physical, that didn't have any sense of spirituality associated with it, because once the soul is gone, there is no life force and there's no soul associated with it. It's just a bizarre story. That's why I put my thing on pause. But I didn't put yours on pause for that reason. Okay, so that's the... what's interesting, he quotes over here, Rabbi Monk quotes that the contrast between Judaism and other nations. Why? Because the Kohen in Judaism is such a pure sense of being, and that doesn't matter who you are, it doesn't matter how learned the Kohen is still a higher person. Right? The Kohen is still a higher person. He can't become defiled. He can't become impure. And yet he compares it to, if you look at other religions, the priest is typically called to the bed of a dying person. That's the highest person. Call the father over, call the priest over to the bed of the dying person, right? Perhaps, he says, perhaps in the belief that the kingdom of God is established when the kingdom of man has ended. But he says that's not the way it works. The Torah teaches differently. The Kohen is not to teach how to die, but how to live. When the family of a dying person is gathered at his bedside, the Kohen remains at a distance, showing that his sacred mission cannot be drawn towards death. The Kohen has to hold himself back, not out of fear of becoming contagious, but rather he keeps away from death to testify to the immortality of the spiritual ideal. Which means the spiritual ideal means that you want to remain with life. Life must have life inside of it in order for you to actually part of that spiritual life. And therefore death is the antithesis of that, and therefore the Kohen has to be the one that totally removes himself from any element of death for that matter. Of course, we know that the Kohen does get to connect to their 7 closest relatives because they still are human, but that's what I would guess is that I don't know the actual reason, but that's what the Torah says explicitly, that the Kohen can defile himself for his 7 closest relatives, but that's really only for the funeral. But after the funeral, the Kohen's not going to the cemetery for yurtzites and things like that, because then they're becoming defiled again. So it is a hard experience for kohanim where they don't necessarily get to go to the cemetery except for those few times. But it's a statement for them that they have to remain in a state of purity, and they have to be a higher people at all costs. So something to keep in mind when it comes to kohanim, that technically they're supposed to uphold their status. I did a funeral a few weeks ago. No, excuse me, it was an unveiling, and the husband said to me, "I'm a Kohen." I'm like, I know. What are you doing here? He says, "It's okay. I learned the laws. I'm not right next to the grave." He was standing, a foot away from the grave. I said, "Unfortunately, you got to be about 8 feet away from the grave." He said, "Hey, I grew up in a religious home. I know the laws here." I'm like, "Okay, you don't." And so they don't feel, people don't necessarily feel like the connection to this, and the Kohen is unlearned. Basically feels like, hey, what's the problem? What's the difference? I don't feel anything different over here, right? I don't feel anything different. But the key is that they have to live up to a higher standard, and we're supposed to try to get them to live up to that higher standard. Kohanim have other benefits that you give them, but they don't have to live up to those standards for those benefits. They do have other benefits. You're supposed to give them food first. If a Kohen comes to your meal, you're supposed to give the Kohen food first. You allow him to lead the Birkat HaMazon, the benching first. So they have a number of benefits because they're considered a higher level of person there, of stature. Are they any better? Not necessarily, but the Kohanim's role originally was to teach the people how to follow the laws. People would come to the temple and they'd offer sacrifices when they're going to the Beis HaMikdash. They'd offer sacrifices, and at that point, the Kohanim would teach everybody. So the 3 times a year you went up to the temple, the Kohanim would teach everybody everything. That has now shifted to the role of, quote unquote, the rabbis. The Talmidei Chachamim, the Torah scholars, they're the ones that have to lead the people, and they're the ones that actually have to teach people to do the right thing. Interesting to know, not related to this, but someone asked me a question this week, and that was, are you allowed to eat while standing? So I'm not familiar with this. You're allowed to eat while standing. So then I looked it up, right? We all eat while we're standing, right? So, everyone, if you eat while you're standing, you can have fat thighs, right? Everyone knows that, right? It's clear. That's a halacha, right? That's what I grew up with, right?
It's a Russian superstition, right?
It's not a superstition. It's a proper etiquette. My mom says, eat like a mensch, sit down when you're eating.
Everybody says eat like a mensch, but how many people say if you eat while you're standing, it's going to go to your thighs, right?
The Russians say if you stand up, you can eat more because more can go out.
Yeah.
Everything goes to my thighs. Whether I sit, lie down, whatever.
Okay, so anyway, so it just happens to be related to that of Kohanim, so Talmidei Chacham. So I looked it up. So there's a quote from, I forgot where it is. In Maseches Derech Eretz Zuta, maybe, that and the Rambam quotes this as well, that Talmidei Chachamim, Torah scholars, those who are supposed to be leading people, they should not eat while standing. Actually, they're supposed to eat in a proper way. It's proper etiquette and it's proper honor for them that they should not eat while they're actually standing. So it doesn't seem like it's a Russian fable. It seems like it's coming from a Jewish source. Your mom was right. Okay. So,
she didn't learn it from anywhere. She made it up.
Okay, so however she got it. But I'm saying a lot of times you have these things that are transferred. They're not sure where they get it from. I told you, I grew up when my wife's grandmother would have all these different traditions that she had. You can't do this, can't do this. Everyone's like, where are you getting this from? And then I started learning, oh, she's right on all these things, On Shabbos, you're supposed to have every table covered. Any table that's supposed to have food on, that you're going to have food, you're supposed to have a tablecloth on every Shabbos, right? Shouldn't leave a table uncovered. So she was very stringent. Make sure every table, cover that table, right? Don't leave a table uncovered. For the honor of Shabbos, you're always supposed to have any table that's going to have food on it, you should have a tablecloth on it before Shabbos. Right? It's supposed to be for every table. So when my wife's family heard, it's like, what? I mean, we'll do it, but like seriously? And then we found it in the Shulchan Aruch that you should have your tables covered. In the Code of Law, it says you should have your tables covered. So a lot of times when think people have these bava mices, as we call them, right? That's what we grew up with. Then they are. Are they stories that Bubby had, or is it really the truth? So it just happens to be that for Talmidei Chachamim, the Torah scholars, who are the replacement, quote unquote, of the kohanim in teaching people, they have other laws associated with them, which means they have to be a little bit more stringent in the way they eat and the way they actually do certain things. And that happened to be one particular example of that. I just close this. So we see that there is what we know as a hierarchy in Judaism, which is like, it's unfair. No, okay, you know what? We have to accept there's a certain element of hierarchy, the Kohen, the Levi, and the Yisrael, and they have different demarcations to different things, but that hierarchy is there for a particular reason. Next, just a couple of things on the holidays. I really wanted to zoom through a couple of points and then get to one main point at the end. I want to discuss about the holidays, the Moedim itself. They're called Mikra'i Kodesh. Mikra'i Kodesh, we saw last night, is the idea of Kriya, that it's a calling to us. A holiday is called a calling to us, that we are supposed to be called out to this holiday, that we are actually connecting to. As if you're sitting around, then you hear someone calling you. They want you to be able to connect to that. So when we refer to a holiday is called Mikra'i Kodesh. It is called something that enables us to actually reach out to it to become on a higher level. So there's the concept of sanctification in time, which is related to that of what the Jewish people sanctify. We ourselves sanctify time because we create the calendar. We determine when the new moon is going to be. Therefore, we're able to create the calendar. So therefore, we have the opportunity to actually create a sense of Kedusha, of holiness. Whereas the Sabbath, Shabbos, is something that's going to happen every 7 days no matter what. The holidays are determined based on the way we set the calendar, which means that Kedusha, something that we can get, is something that is actually available for us to actually create that ultimate level of holiness within our world. Kedusha is a key component that we discussed last week, but it's a running theme that we're actually going to see, is that Kedusha, which again we translate as holiness, is when we actually become elevated to a higher state. We become elevated to a higher state that we are looked up upon by other nations, and it's something that each of us have to be able to connect to. Now, I understand that it might not necessarily be so easy for us to understand this, but every single holiday has a particular element of Kedusha, of holiness associated with it, that we're trying to connect to. So, by connecting to these holidays is part of what makes us into what's known as the Goy Kadosh, this holy nation. So what the Nesiva Shalom explains is as follows. He says there's a concept called Olam, Shana, and Nefesh. Olam, which will translate into world, which means the physical sense of the world. There's a sense of holiness that exists in the physical sense of the world. That sense of holiness is the physical side of it is that you have a temple, you have a Beis Hamikdash. Today we have a kotel, we have a Western Wall. But there's holiness, physical holiness that exists within this world. And therefore, when a person goes to the kotel, when a person goes to the temple, there's a sense of holiness that emanates from a physical place. And that is the concept of what we know as a temple, otherwise known as the Beis Hamikdash. We've discussed this before, but just as important to reiterate that the word temple, as we use Beit Hamikdash. Beis Hamikdash, which is house of holiness. That's what the Beis Hamikdash stands for, is the house of holiness. People call it a temple, not really sure why. Perhaps it's coming from other religions. They have a temple, they have a shrine, they have things like that. But this idea of temple, we don't call our shuls temples. Even though you'll see that there are shuls called temples, we don't call our shuls temples. Why don't we call our shul a temple?
Because of the respect, first and second.
Because the respect for the first and second temple and the third temple. Whereas the Reform wanted to show that there is no such thing as a future temple. The Reform felt that the history is history, and there's not going to be a third temple. Therefore, we're going to call all of our synagogues temples. Right? So we make our business, whenever we refer to a Reform, potentially conservative as well, we will just say it's considered a temple. Temple Ramat Zion. Temple this. Why? Because they want to make it clear that there is no such thing as a third temple that's going to be. And part of the tenets of faith that we have is that there were the first two, and all the prophecies tell us that there will be a third. So we never call ours a temple. We'll call it a shul, we'll call it a synagogue, we'll call it a Beit Knesset, which means a house of gathering. But we're never going to call it a temple because that temple is a reference to the Beis Hamikdash. And therefore, for the honor of the Beis Hamikdash, or the Bate Mikdash, so two of them, we don't actually call it a temple. So when I use this word temple, referring to the Mishkan, or to the Beis Hamikdash, it's only that English word that's actually used, but it really means the house of holiness, Beis Hamikdash, the house that creates holiness for us. So there is a concept of Olam. Olam means that there's a physical place within this world where Kedusha sets forth, where there's holiness that emanates. If you've been to the Kotel and you've experienced it, you understand that experience. Not just simply because of a really tall wall, right? It's because of the fact you feel something palpably different. Not everybody feels it. Sometimes people feel it in different places where they go, but they feel a certain sense of Kedusha. Sometimes people will go to certain cemeteries and they feel a sense of holiness associated with it. So there's a concept of Shana. Shana is the concept throughout the year, is that Yom Tov, the holiday, and Shabbos and the Sabbaths, those are another form of Kedusha, another form of holiness that we actually have within the world. So these two so far are the ones that actually enable us to have physical and time-based holiness associated with it. Okay? So the human being is really based on time and based on space. So Shabbos and the Mishkan, or Shabbos and the temple, or Shabbos and the holidays, those are the concepts of Kedusha, of holiness that exists in time and holiness that exists in place. There's one other place of holiness that we need to access. And what is it when it's not the place and when it's not the time? What happens when you're not by the temple? What happens when you're not by the Beis Hamikdash? What happens when it's not Shabbos or a holiday? How does a person access Kedusha? There's one other thing that we're missing. Who can guess what that is? Huh? Inside, the soul. Right? Very good. Right? And that is the concept that the Torah is going to tell us. V'hit kadishtem, you shall make yourselves holy. V'yisem kedoshim, and then you will actually become holy. Which means the individual has the opportunity to actually create this sense of holiness. Which means if you were to compare and you say, okay, I learned about how Shabbos and Yom Tov is really holy, really special. There's a lot of things I can't do. I learned how the Kotel or the Beis Hamikdash is really holy. Can't do bad things there. It's a very special place. On the same vein, the human being also has that opportunity to create that level of holiness for themselves in a big way where they themselves become holy. If you have ever met someone of holy stature, if you have ever met or been in the presence of a great rabbi, then you kind of know what that feeling is. You walk in there and you're kind of frozen, light, you feel like light is emanating from them and you don't even know what to do. Because you feel that sense of holiness where that person has it. Now, for each of us, it's different because you may all feel like I can feel anybody's holier than me, and you can feel that the next person's holier than you. But if you go to the higher echelons of people that are on that level of holiness, you'll feel that palpable sense of what it really means to be holy. So this holiness comes from a person purifying themselves from all of the regular activities that they do. If they can take themselves and change their regular activity into something a little bit different, that's where a little bit of holiness actually comes from. So this is the concept of what the holidays are there for us for. It's a time. It's not just a weekly time, that each one has a special event that happens in it that enables us to actually become a holy individual. With Shavuos coming up, it's important to know that this is the beginning of the giving of the Torah. And one of the aspects of Shavuos that is really special is there's only a tradition that we have to stay up all night. It's only a tradition. It's not even a law, but there's a tradition that we have to stay up all night. And part of the reason why we stay up all night is to signify this idea that we want to recreate the giving of the Torah. And the Jews back then did not stay up all night, and we want to show that we want to be able to be on that higher level so we can actually stay up that entire night. But there's a concept here within Shavuos, is that Shavuos is as if it's being given to you anew, like you just received it. And that's how God spoke to us face to face, whatever that means, face to face. But every one of us heard God's word, and therefore that's the concept over here means, that when we enter into that world of Shavuot or Shavuos, we're supposed to realize for ourselves that we're being now accepted into Judaism. That now we're getting the Torah for the first time. Even though we may have learned about it, we may have been following Judaism to some extent, but now is when we're really connecting. It's like, wow, I really feel like I can become a different person. I really feel like I'm part of this amazing nation who's doing amazing things. That's a very special thing to think about when we enter into Shavuos. One of the things that we have prior to Shavuos is that of Omer. The Omer is, anyone? The Omer?
Sacrifice. No, what's Omer is? It's a sacrifice.
It's a tragic day, right? Is that the one?
Kind of.
It's a first.
Kind of.
Sacrifice of this
It's
week.
like-
Not the Odyssey. Don't confuse it. You know.
That's Homer.
It's all the
Isn't
students,
it
the students of Rabbi the
They
past.
were,
Akiva.
Oh, is that when the fires all around there?
That's Lag BaOmer. That's this coming Sunday, Lag BaOmer. Right. This coming summer is when you have all the bonfires, right?
Right.
Or Saturday night.
He's right?
Yeah.
It's,
Omer when they bring the first sacrifice.
The Omer is a sacrifice.
Sacrifice.
The Omer is a sacrifice brought on the second day of Passover. The Omer is a sacrifice. It's an offering that whatever the barley is standing up tall, and you're going to bring. You can bring the sacrifice every day until Shavuos, and Shavuos have a new sacrifice that's brought. So that's the Korban Omer. That's the sacrifice. It's true that Rabbi Akiva's students died during that time. Also, it's a period of mourning that we have, and everyone was writing all these things, right? So one aspect that we have when it comes to the Omer, when it comes to counting the Omer, which is whatever. Today was what was it? 29. Today is 29 days of the Omer, which is
4 weeks.
4 weeks and 1 day of the Omer, right? Huh? There's a total of 49. A total of 49 days of counting, and the 50th day is Shavuot, right? Is Shavuos. But we're up to 29. So when we count that Omer, the halacha dictates for us one amazing hint. And the halacha says that when you count the Omer, you have to count it standing. It's questionable if you fulfill it if you're sitting down, but you have to actually count the Omer while you're standing. Really? Like this is such an important...
You can't eat while you're counting the Omer?
Good question. Excellent. Only the Talmud Chacham can.
But isn't it going to be like you're pretty much like standing there in the temple? You know, you kind of like giving a sacrifice when you're
So what is
counting.
it, Omer, again?
So the Omer is a measurement. The Omer is a measurement, but it's coming from a barley offering, right? So it says, when are you going to count? It says, Me heichel chermesh bekama. When the stalks seemingly are in their, when they're in this ripe grain and they're bekama, they're standing stalks. So we learn from this idea of bekama, standing, that we're supposed to, that's when we're supposed to count. And when that time happens, that is when, therefore you're supposed to be able to, you're supposed to stand up when we say it, right? Which is interesting in itself that, okay, it's an interesting law. We're learning it from a verse that talks about when the grain is standing, that's when you're supposed to count. Just like the grain is standing, so too when you count, you should be standing as well. A little bit bizarre, because it's not really related. It's like, talk to me about me, tell me I should stand. But it's talking about a grain that's standing, but that's what the Talmud tells us. So Schwab points out the idea that, that even though the law tells you that's what you have to do, it means that the Gemara is teaching us something. It's hinting to us why. And the answer it's hinting to us over here is that we are compared to standing grain. What does that mean? We're compared to standing grain of barley that's sitting in the field. Really? You ever feel that? You ever feel that way? No? You ever say it to your spouse? Honey, you remind me of standing grain in the field. Right? Right?
You're sleeping on the couch.
Yeah, you're sleeping on the couch. You're not going to be eating sitting or standing. Right? So... it says we are compared to, the Torah says like this, it says that you're going to count for 7 weeks from the time this grain is actually standing up. And when it says you're going to count it for the grain standing up, it means that you're going to be standing. Why? Because we ourselves are compared to the grain of barley. Why are we compared to the grain of barley? So he says that when you fulfill this mitzvah, we have to imagine for ourselves the following. They go into the field and they cut this standing grain, and now they're bringing that as a sacrifice, which means for ourselves, as we prepare ourselves, this is not, it's no coincidence that we had Passover. It's a certain level of freedom, right? And then we have to count every day. The sacrifice is being brought, and we're counting. The sacrifice is being brought, and now we're counting every day. Okay, and then we reach the holiday of Shavuos. When we reach this holiday of Shavuos, it's the when we get the Torah, right? Like, what was that interim time? What did I do with that time? Okay, I counted. What did I do with it? But the answer is you have to imagine yourself as if you are growing and then cut off from that place of growth and then offered up as a sacrifice. So he says that the idea behind it means that we're supposed to disconnect ourselves from the karka, from the ground, which means we're disconnecting ourselves from that physical basis of who we are. Again, we left Egypt. When we left Egypt, we were still very base people. We're very deeply connected to all the physical things that were there. We complained many times while we were in the desert. Why can't we have meat? Why can't we have this? All these things. Therefore, the cutting over here is representing this idea is that we actually have to cut ourselves off so we can be offered as a sacrifice, that we ourselves are sacrifices for Hashem. And that's what a person has to be able to realize for themselves, that you have to be able to cut yourself off from the fact that you grow from the ground. We don't nourish ourselves. We don't spiritually nourish ourselves from all physicality. There's a little bit that helps us, but we have to be able to move to the next level to separate ourselves from all the physicality that exists within our lives. Okay, so that's an idea that relates to that of the Omer, where we're supposed to be thinking that we're separating ourselves and slowly building ourselves so we can actually receive the Torah. That's the key. To just go from Pesach and get the Torah 50 days later, like, can we just have it now? Like, I'm ready. No, obviously we're not ready, and therefore we need to do something about it. Okay? Now I just want to, I want to be able to present the following idea, and that is this idea, V'niktashti b'soch b'nei Yisrael. So the Torah tells us that we're going to become, that Hashem tells us, you shall not defile my name, V'niktashti b'toch b'nei Yisrael, and you must sanctify my name, because I am Hashem, the one who sanctifies you. I took you out of Egypt to be a God for you. So what does it actually mean over here to sanctify God's name? So this is what we call a very difficult law. The difficult law is that there's certain times in your life that you're going to have to give up your life. And we know that there was known as the 3 cardinal sins. If someone comes to you and says, I want you to either violate idol worship, murder, or adultery, then we say, and we know, we just say, okay, I'd rather you take my life rather than me violating those things. So this is a concept that we call the purest level of what we call Kiddush Hashem, sanctifying God's name. Now the word Kiddush Hashem is a different terminology. It's usually, people refer to it as dying al Kiddush Hashem, right? They're allowing themselves to be killed for the sake of sanctifying God's name, and those people have a very high place in heaven. As it says that the people who are killed for the sake of God's name there's no piece of creation, no human being has a right to question anything they did have, which means that those people that died, even if they weren't religious, but yet they died for the sanctification of God's name, there's nobody higher than them in the heavenly spheres. Those people that died in that heinous way. So the Rambam writes on this that every single Jew is commanded on Kiddush Hashem, on sanctifying God's name, as it comes from this week's Parsha. V'nikdash, so sanctify me amongst the Jewish people. What's difficult about this is that we think that, okay, 3 cardinal sins, hopefully I'll never come to it, and therefore we'll be okay. So, but that's not ultimately what Kiddush Hashem is. Kiddush Hashem is when you sanctify God's name. Generally, sanctification of God's name happens amongst 10 people. You need 10 people to have that sanctification. 10 Jews generally, and that's considered sanctification of God's name. But a verse is quoted in Tehillim that suggests that we are servants of Hashem, ki haragnu kol hayom, that every single day we're being killed, and all day we're being killed. And the obvious question is it true that we're being killed all day? It's not true. And it's not every day. Maybe some people are, but we ourselves are not. And yet the Torah seems to hint that there's a certain element of what we call Mesiras Nefesh, giving over our lives for the sake of Hashem. And we have to ask ourselves, when is it in life that we're actually giving up our lives for Hashem? Every one of us here at the table, when is it that we're giving up our lives for Hashem? And I think this is the key component over here. There's a general struggle that every human being goes through, and that struggle is, can I do this? And why am I doing this? Why am I pushing myself to do this? Which means that we have a general rule, and the rule is for our jobs. Every one of our jobs is we must sanctify God's name in a constant battle. That constant battle is going to be the evil that exists within us and the evil that surrounds us. So sometimes it's going to be evil that's coming from terrible, evil people that are trying to kill us, and sometimes evil is going to be the influences around us, and sometimes evil is going to be the things that are just building up inside of us. So there's a constant battle that every single person has to go through. And I think we might have mentioned it last week, that every time a person fights and is able to overcome the struggle, they themselves become kadosh. You become a holy individual. So when it comes to V'nikdashti b'toch b'nei Yisrael, there's a key component here, and this is what I just want to address. That we're fighting against a Yetzer Hara. We're fighting against our evil inclination on a regular basis. There's nobody who isn't. If they're not, then they're dead. But everyone is fighting against the evil inclination. They could be sitting quietly in a chair and they're fighting the evil inclination. And it's something that attacks us on a regular basis. But here's the key. Sometimes we go through Judaism and we feel like it's not just such a burden, it's so awful. It's so terrible. I can't do this. Right? How do we know this? Because if it wasn't, then every aspect of Judaism would be so easy for us to do. Right? It goes to everybody, right? Let's say, for me to say like, okay, I'm going to sit and study Torah, or I could be doing 15 other things, right? What's my easiest, what pulls me quicker? Well, let me do these things first, and then I'll go study. Why don't you go study? If that's the ultimate level of life, go study. The answer is, because that's my struggle. Because I know that I'd much rather, quote unquote, be doing the other things, and then I'll get to Torah study, right? Like, meaning if it's like, okay, let me eat dinner, and then I'll go learn. What should I do first, dinner or learn? Well, I have plenty of time to learn, but I'm not going to necessarily have all the time to eat dinner. Meanwhile, I'm sitting there eating for who knows how long and not learning. So we all have the excuses as to what we're not doing. And I'm just giving you the scenario for me, but everybody has a scenario where they feel like it's very hard for them to give up their life for God. It's very hard because it's almost unnatural for us to do to some extent. And therefore, the Torah is coming to tell us over here that V'nikdashti b'toch b'nei Yisrael, I want you, I, God, will become sanctified amongst you. When you are able to fight this inclination, no matter how difficult it is, that's when you actually become sanctified. So a lot of times we have, as we said, the fake it till you make it concept. So the fake it till you make concept means that, it's really hard and I don't want to do this. I really don't want to do this. But that's where sanctification actually comes in. That's when we actually reach a higher level of holiness within ourselves. So I want to address it. It's almost like the elephant in the room for most of us, and that is that when it comes to Judaism and its rigors and its difficulties, it's not easy. But it's not easy being the chosen nation. It's not easy being on top. And yes, there are going to be times when it's going to be difficult to fulfill anything. And if you think like, oh, no, I'm the one who has it hard, but they have it easy. So there's different types of personalities that go out there. Some people go, look, I do my thing and that's it. I don't want to do any more. Okay? Well, there's not much we can say, but we know that each of us have a certain obligation of what we need to do. And we also know that it's difficult. So to deny it and say it's not difficult, it's trying to somewhat fool ourselves, but it's trying to help us saying, no, you'll get through it. It's okay. It's fun. Keeping kosher is so much fun. Isn't it the best? Yeah, I love it. It's so much fun. So I grew up with it, so it's easy. Okay? It's easy for me to do. Like, when does it get a little harder? See, for me, I am able to have a switch. If I don't want to eat something, I basically tell my own mind that it's just not kosher. Like let's say that someone's serving some food, I'm like, oh man, potato chips. I'm like, no, they're treif. I'm not going to eat them. They're just not kosher, right? And this I won't eat them. Because I was able to grow up with that that if this is not kosher, it's not kosher. The famous joke, I don't even know if it's a joke or if it's real, that this woman was in a supermarket and she sees this African American there with her with like her 5-year-old child in the supermarket, and the woman's telling her child like, no, it's not kosher, it's not kosher, it's not kosher. So the woman goes over and goes, excuse me, are you Jewish? She says, no, I'm not Jewish. She says, why do you keep telling your kid it's not kosher? She says, I know, I hang around all these Jews, and I see every time the kid wants a candy, they just say, no, it's not kosher, and they just let it go. So I started doing it to my kid, and just says, not kosher, and she just walks away, So that's it, it works, That's how I grew up. Like, if it's not kosher, just move on. It's not a struggle. I don't have the issue for it. So, but for someone who's going through a struggle, it's a real struggle. And it's very hard. So each of us have those other struggles. We have a struggle one way or another, and it's important to recognize that struggle. It's important to recognize that every time you overcome it, it's like, wow, that was awesome. I did that, you can compare it to dieting if you need to, but there's a struggle that exists there, and that struggle is what creates Kedusha. That struggle is where your free will lives and thrives. Whereas, again, we had this conversation before, but the areas where someone else may struggle, I don't struggle. So I don't struggle driving by In-N-Out. I don't think I ever will struggle by driving by In-N-Out. But some of you may struggle by going by In-N-Out, right? I don't have that struggle. It's just because I didn't grow up with it, and therefore it's not.
You're not missing much.
So some will say I'm not missing much. Others will be like, "Are you kidding me? It's the best."
You're missing. You know what they're missing? People coming from New York just to eat it In-N-Out.
Right. Okay. Exactly. Right. I'm not missing out on Chipotle. I'm not missing out on Sonic. Right. All these places that that for some of you, you are missing out, and it's important to know. You know what? I'm missing out. But that means you're missing out for the sake of God. And if someone says, "No, it's not for the sake of God. It's for my husband. It's for my wife. That's what I'm doing," it's still at the end of the day for the sake of God. That's really what it comes down to. Okay? So sometimes it's masked by, it's for my spouse. But the truth is, you're doing it for another reason. It's not just for your spouse, and your spouse is not doing it for himself or herself. They're doing it for a higher purpose. But I think it's important here to recognize this. This is a struggle that people go to, and this is part of your Kiddush Hashem. And every time you go by this place, or whatever the thing is, let's say it's kosher, and you don't eat there, that's the Kiddush Hashem you created, but that means that you created that Kedusha inside yourself. You became a holy person in such a special way that no one else is going to look and go, "Hey, what's going on?" Nothing, I feel different. Why? You created a Kedusha that didn't exist before. You went with your free will, you were able to overcome. That's a remarkable experience. And this is really what we go through over here when there's a concept of, the Nesiv Hashem quotes this verse and says, "Ki alecha haragnu kol hayom." For you, we are being killed throughout the day. That is the terminology used from the verse in Tehillim. For you are being killed throughout the day. And so what does it mean throughout the day? So he compares it to another verse that has throughout the day associated with it, and that is when God has man. He says the Yetzer Hara, the inclination of man, is rak kol hayom, is only evil all day. Which means, what is our struggle that we feel like we're giving up ourselves for? We're giving up ourselves for God all day. Throughout our daily life, there's so many different areas where we struggle. There's so many victories that we have, and obviously Judaism is not supposed to be about, look at the sacrifice I made. Look at the sacrifice I made. It's not supposed to be that way. But when you get to that point and you're living in that place of, look at that sacrifice, it's a point of victory for you as well. To realize, you know what? These sacrifices actually make me holy. Parents have sacrificed for their children all the time, right? And they'll say, I gave up this, I give up sleep, I give up, vacations, I give up all these things for my kids. You call that sacrifice, but you call it, it's worth it because I'm bringing up the next generation. So too over here when it comes to Judaism, there are sacrifices. You can call it a sacrifice if you want. It's really a sanctification. You're really actually becoming a sanctified human being here every single opportunity that you have, and it's the most remarkable experience that a person has. So therefore, this concept of v'nikdashti, I shall be sanctified amongst my people for the sake of God, it's going to apply when there's a terrible person trying to attack us. It's going to apply when we have external things surrounding us, and it's going to apply when we have our own internal struggles as well. And this is really where Shem Shemayim, where the name of heaven is becoming sanctified. So you imagine this, you are the bearers of these batons that say, I am a person who sanctifies God's name every single day. It's a remarkable thing. Especially when you're struggling, especially when it's difficult, and especially when you're not enjoying it. And it's clearly not for your benefit. You don't have that enjoyment. For me, if there's something that I do, like, I feel so good about it. For some of you, it's like, oh my goodness, I feel so bad about it. Think of that sanctification. That's amazing. It's remarkable. And that's a very special experience that a person has. And this is really the higher level of Amunah. Of course, we'd love to get to a place of joy when we get there. But this is the opportunity every Jew has to be able to mekadesh, to sanctify God's name. And the more we do it, the easier it actually becomes. And the more we sanctify, the more we have greater opportunities actually to sanctify God's name. So this is a special moment that we have when it says that we're supposed to become holy people. And we are v'nikdashti b'toch b'nei Yisrael, that God's name is becoming sanctified. Do you understand this? It could be on an individual level, could be on a global level, could be like you're going out and people say, where you go? Oh, I'm not going there. It's like, wow, what you just changed there was a remarkable experience. And of course, if we do it in private as well, that experience is also very special, especially to God and especially to our soul. So these are the things that really hold on to souls. I think I shared with you, if you look back in the early 1900s, that the people that were fired every week for Shabbos, every week. You know, the boss would say, if you don't come in Shabbos, then don't bother coming in Monday. And they would be fired, and they lived difficult, very difficult lives. They had lives of starvation over there. But people talk about these stories and they say, you know what? My great-grandfather or grandfather lived through that and went through that time. And that is the period that actually gave their grandchildren that sense of strength that we can do this. We can accomplish it. And you're living off their coattails. You're living off of their coattails because of the sanctifications that they've done. So think about this for ourselves. Every time we go through that struggle and it's hard for us, our children, grandchildren, and the like are actually living off of that as well for us. They are going to have a higher level of spirituality because of what we are going through generations earlier for them. And that is what we call the sanctification of God's name. This is a special moment for us to have that opportunity. That's why I think, as difficult as sometimes Judaism is, each step is really sanctification, and it will have, it's planting its seeds for the future generations who are yet to come. So we're going to stop this evening. Any questions, anybody?
I actually have one I keep forgetting asking. So Chabad is doing this thing like meditation for each day, like for each sferot within
Right.
sferot. They're doing this meditation for each of them. Is that like Ashkenazi tradition too?
We have it also, meaning we say it in the Siddur. It says what each day actually refers to. So we say what each one, Netzach, Gvura, Tefer, all these things. So we have that as well, what they have. I even have an app on my phone you can download, and it tells you that same thing that Chabad is doing, because it comes from they have the calendar.
I'm saying that.
And they have an app that goes through each thing, which you can focus on. Today is going to be endurance, and I'm going to focus on the following character trait of endurance. You know, see, it's Kabbalah. It's Kabbalistic emanations of what's happening during the element of sphere each day for a person to work on themselves. So I haven't been doing it that much this year. In the past I had, to really just try to focus on one thing, each day, or at least that week. If this is the week of Gvura, it means I work on my strength. If it's the week of Tiferet, I work on splendor, of different things.
So did these days, did they actually relate to everything that these 49 days that Jews in a desert were doing, like cleaning up themselves, or
no
no?
question. I don't know if it's the exact thing, but it basically within Kabbalah, each of these 49 days it's not say in the actuality of what they did, but the Torah says you're going to count 49 days. That's what the Torah says. You're going to count 49 days or 50 days, right? So those are correlated in Kabbalah. So from this week's Parsha, where it says you're going to count the 49 days, that's when Kabbalah tells you what each day has a reference to in your spiritual makeup of how you can work on it. Certain specific things that deal with your own emotions and the like, each day has a special thing. So it's not about the Jews walking, it's about later on when we're commanded, count 50 days, each one of those days has those steps. That's what it is.